Good evening. Welcome. So, quick show of hands, how many people here think that winter is never ending? It has been a long DC winter, my goodness. Well, I appreciate everybody coming out on, unfortunately, yet another cold evening around here, though not as cold as it was last time. This is a continuation in our series on total recovery, solving the mystery of chronic pain and depression. The goal of this, as many of you know who've been here before, is to reframe, to redefine this business of chronic pain and depression, because we're actually pretty abysmal at treating these things. If you look at the occurrence of chronic pain and major depressive disorders, and the same can be said of generalized anxiety disorders and post-traumatic stress syndrome, you find that there's a huge overlap. And that in fact, we've got about 21 million people a year suffering with major depressive disorder. Now, this slide says that there's 47 million, and I actually happen to like this number better, but if you believe the more recent studies that have come out from the Institute of Medicine, they claim that 116 million people in this country suffer with chronic pain. It's a third of the country. So, but I think if we're going to be really precise in terms of how many people really suffer with chronic pain, the answer is probably closer to about 47 million. But the overlap between these conditions is huge, 50 to 65%. And more importantly, if we look at the ends of these, the odds of getting better, okay, are about 50% on either end. Not earth-shattering, but at least 50%. If you look at the group in the middle, the odds of getting better by some studies, 9%. We stink at this. We don't know what it is we're treating. We don't know what we're looking at. And what the literature is beginning to show us is that we now have some insight as to what that is and what's going on, and thus we have to completely rethink how we're treating these diseases. So we're looking at what I've now defined as central sensitization syndrome. Central sensitization syndrome is the co-occurrence of chronic pain and a neuropsychiatric condition, depression, generalized anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and possibly even bipolar disease. Evidence in the literature that that's also neuroinflammatory in nature. The basis of these things is that they are neuroinflammatory. The brain is inflamed, all right, and that inflammation is mediated by the immune system. So it's neuroimmunologic disease causing neuroinflammation. And of greater problem, it causes neurodysregulation, that is the way the brain works, is disrupted, and it causes neurodegeneration. It's particularly a problem because the longer these conditions go on, the harder they are to treat. The basis of this problem is the immune system in the central nervous system, which is the microglia. And there's a whole bunch of things that will affect the microglia and bring them into an upregulated position. And the work that I've done and the focus of my studies has been on microglia, what turns them on, what turns them off, and looking by reframing this as neuroinflammatory diseases, we come up with different answers. Okay, so one young woman that I saw today has had problems with chronic headaches and depressive disorders. She has been treated what they thought was quite thoroughly at one of the leading headache centers in the country up in Michigan. For the last 5 years, they have tried everything inside and out without any success in really getting control of her headaches. They missed the diagnosis of Lyme disease. So I have other patients where severe depressive disorders, they've missed the diagnosis of celiac disease. So when we see these conditions and they're so unresponsive to what we're treating, the bottom line is we're actually missing the cause of the problem. And as long as the cause of the problem remains in the system and the system remains inflamed, we aren't getting it better. There's a lot of things that can set off the microglia in the central nervous system, so we have to be careful about looking at all of these things, and we've talked about some of them in prior lectures. In today's lecture, we're going to be focusing on specifically on metabolic syndrome and obesity. These are actually inflammatory states in the body. Metabolic syndrome, I'll let Dr. Kahan go through the specifics of these diagnoses, but basically 3 out of 5 of these equals a definition of metabolic syndrome. Huge problem. We have almost over 20% of Americans suffer from this condition, and if you're over the age of 60, 40% of Americans are suffering with metabolic syndrome. Why is this important? aside from the general health issues. We see elevation in a number of inflammatory factors. These are the same factors, interleukin-2 in particular, and tissue necrosis factor alpha, that we see elevated in issues with chronic pain and chronic depression. They are factors which are secreted by microglia in the central nervous system that mediate inflammation. If we look at metabolic syndrome, the occurrence of pain, in fact, correlates with the occurrence of metabolic syndrome. So women with fibromyalgia were 5.56 times more likely to have metabolic syndrome than control group. Chronic neck pain in males, relative risk was 2.1, and in women it was 1.5, 50% greater occurrence of depression in this group. So these are inflammatory conditions, and as to be expected with inflammatory conditions, you see other inflammatory conditions in the brain. Obesity and being overweight, this is the definition of them, but more to the point is 65% of adults are either overweight or obese. And obesity, again, and overweight is again associated as an inflammatory condition in the body. And sure enough, we see a much higher prevalence of back pain, chronic headaches, migraines, tension headaches, osteoarthritis, fibromyalgia, and abdominal pain. If you look at depression in these individuals, 55% increased risk of developing depression in people who are obese, and there's a 58% increased risk of becoming obese in those individuals who are depressed. All right, inflammation in the body is the thing we have to go after in any and all forms if we're going to be successful at treating these conditions of central sensitization syndrome. Lots of things that can help in terms of reducing the inflammation. We've had lectures on meditation. We've had lectures on prolotherapy, regenerative medicine. We've had lectures on nutrition before, but we'll have a much more in-depth lecture tonight. HBOT, which Dr. Sam Shore talked about last time. So we're slowly going through the list of things of what we can do in order to solve this problem and resolve this problem. Plug for my book. My book is due out May 6th for Rodale, and will be really outlines all of these issues through case studies and what's going on. Tonight, I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Scott Kahan. Dr. Kahan got his bachelor's in biomedical engineering at Columbia University and received his medical degree from Drexel College of Medicine. He completed his residency at Johns Hopkins, where he served as chief resident, and he also received his master's in public health from Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Scott is only one of 7 physicians worldwide who are board certified in both preventive medicine and obesity medicine. He's director of the George Washington University-based Strategies to Overcome and Prevent Obesity Alliance, whose purpose is to advance the public conversation about obesity and develop practical strategies to combat obesity and weight bias. He is also founder and director of the National Center for Weight and Wellness in Washington, D.C., which provides clinical treatment for obesity and weight reduction health issues. Dr. Kahan is one of the real stars in this area in the country, and we're privileged to have him here tonight to speak to us. Scott, glad to have you join us. Also, please, if anybody has cell phones on, remind you to turn them off.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. And is there a laser pointer on this by any chance? It's okay, because I brought my own. I've done this enough times.
All right. So we'll talk a little bit about inflammation and obesity today, and I want to keep it at a big picture level. There's so much detail, and so much detail that we really don't even know still. But I think that thinking about it from a big picture perspective can really lead to a valuable set of insights into how these things play out together, and then also leads us into a couple of take-home messages that I think might be valuable for you. Let's start with an exercise. If you can stand up, let's do that. You don't have to. If you want to sit in place, that's perfectly fine. But what I want to do right now is have us all either jog in place, or you can just sort of pick up your feet like this, or sort of move back and forth. I want to be moving a little bit. And there's a reason for this beyond just it's good for us all to get some exercise. But let's just hop up and down a little bit. Just move a little bit. It's kind of fun too, especially after a busy day sitting in front of the computer screen. I haven't moved all day. Okay, we can stop now. All right, now take a seat. And now here's what I want you to do. When I count to 3, I want you to take a really deep breath, and I want you to hold it in as deep as you can. 1, 2, deep breath. And we're going to hold it for 1.5 minutes. You can start again if that made you laugh. Deep breath. Let's just hold it. I'm looking at that clock there. We're at about 7 seconds right now. Keep going. It's tough, huh? We're at about 15 seconds. Okay, you can exhale now. Why am I starting by talking about this? Why is it so hard for us to do something as simple as just holding our breath? Well, our body fights against it. We can do it for a few seconds, maybe we can even do it for a minute. But eventually, your body notices that something's wrong. Your oxygen levels go down, your carbon dioxide levels go up. Your body has very sensitive sensors for carbon dioxide, and when that happens, there are signals that are sent back to the brain, and the brain takes in all that's going on and kind of sort of says, hey, you're suffocating. Breathe, you moron. And that's what you do. And you can white knuckle past the pain and the uncomfortableness of holding your breath in for a few seconds, maybe a few tens of seconds, maybe a minute, maybe 1.5 minutes if you've got really strong willpower, if you will, I suppose. But eventually you're gonna take a breath because your body thinks you're suffocating and it takes over. Okay, so let's take this back to weight. A very analogous situation happens when it comes to weight and weight loss. Okay, so you decide maybe it's New Year's, or for whatever reason you decide to go on that diet. You get all your Jenny Craig food together or whatever it is. You get your Atkins book ready to go. You plan it out. You get the food and so forth, and you start your diet. And it's going great. And you're losing weight. And then you start exercising. You're going to the gym. You're getting, you have lots of energy. You're getting a lot of good feedback from your friends and your family members. A week goes by, 2, 3, 4 weeks go by, and everything's going great. But then something happens, and it happens over the course of a few days to a few weeks to even a few months. A little bit longer time period than with the example of holding your breath, but very much analogous. Slowly your body, as it sees what's going on, as it's taking in all of the different surveillance pieces of your body, it realizes that you're effectively starving, or at least it thinks that you're starving. Your fat cells are getting smaller. A number of other messages say to your brain that you're starving. And then your brain says, well, I'm not going to let you starve. I'm going to push against that because for the vast majority of our existence, starving was far more of an issue than excess nutrition, than overnutrition. And so there's a number of pathways by which this happen, but it happens extremely strongly, especially after the first little bit of it. So one example of what mediates this is a hormone called leptin. Many of you have probably heard of that by now. It's a hormone that's specifically made by fat cells. And it does a whole bunch of things throughout the body. One of the key things that it does is it communicates the level of fat cells in your body, the level of backup fuel stores in your body. And so as you're losing weight and your fat cells are getting smaller, you're making less leptin. And as your brain notices that and registers that, that's, again, one of the key signals that suggests that you are losing weight and, in theory, starving. And so your brain then tries to counteract that. And it does it in part by lowering metabolic rate, because why waste energy if you're getting low on energy? And it also does it by upregulating a number of hormones and other chemicals that increase appetite. So it's goading you, it's pushing you to eat more. And that's what happens. It's very much analogous to what happens with the suffocation example. Your brain tells you to eat because you're starving. Let's look a little bit closer at one of the pieces of this that's happening. In the hypothalamus is one of the key brain areas where this is happening, particularly in the sort of appetite center there. And you can see here's the example. Normally there's a balance of the gas pedal, if you will, to eat more, with the brake pedal to eat less. And it's sort of balanced out very nice. As you lose weight and there becomes less signals of leptin from the blood, from the fat cells, that signal from leptin goes to the hypothalamus, and the two main neurons that are effectively this brake and gas pedal on eating is called the POMC neurons. When that's stimulated, you tend to eat less. And the NPY and agouti-related protein neurons. And when those are stimulated, you tend to eat more. Okay? So, again, in this example, it's mediated through leptin. There's many other hormones and chemicals that play into this. I put a couple others in here. I put this in here just because I think it's interesting. This is ghrelin. It's a hormone made in your stomach. It's particularly important when it comes to bariatric surgery. So we used to think that bariatric surgery mostly worked by cutting out part of your stomach, and therefore you can't eat that much because you get full quicker, and that's why you lose weight. And now we know that that's a very small piece of why you lose weight. A much bigger piece is that when you cut out a part of your stomach, it changes the expression of ghrelin, and again, through similar pathways, ultimately through these neuronal systems, you end up eating less. And eventually we're probably going to have drugs that can mimic this and some of these other pathways, but I think it's important to keep it in there. Again, there's many pathways that work in here, but this is a really important one when it comes to leptin. So let's look at a version of this scenario where even if you're not necessarily losing weight, there becomes an imbalance in the POMC and NPY neurons such that you end up having much more signals to eat more and also signals to lower metabolic rate. And one of the ways that we're now learning that this happens is when there's inflammation that occurs inside the hypothalamic neuronal areas. And that messes up, effectively, this balance between the brake and the gas to eat more or eat less. All right. So one of the key studies in this area was with mice, and what they did was feed mice a high-fat diet, and that instituted inflammation in this hypothalamic area, which led to the mice gaining weight. So we have here just a little example of that. This is, you have BMI here, or body weight here. And then you have what is effectively a signal of how much inflammation is happening in the hypothalamic area. For those mice that experienced inflammation in their hypothalamus, they ended up gaining more weight compared with those mice that did not experience that same inflammation in their hypothalamus. So this inflammation in a key brain area, we're now learning, is a strong determinant of and driver of the beginning and progression of obesity. This is something that's brand new. We knew for a long time that there's more to all of this than just, again, white-knuckling through diets and having a lot of willpower to exercise more and eat less. And now we're starting to understand a lot more about the chemical nature of that, about the physiologic nature of that. And so soon this will be replicated in humans. There's numerous other pathways that are being studied, and we're already seeing more and more of this data, and hopefully we'll have a number of treatments for it. But it's a great example of how inflammation plays into the situation of obesity. What we normally think of, and what we have lots more data on, is the opposite end of that. So here we're learning that inflammation can cause or predispose to the development of obesity. What we've known for a long time is that obesity causes inflammation, and that's likely the main mediator by which obesity causes other chronic diseases and such. So here's an example of what's happening in fat cells as most people gain weight. Doesn't happen in everybody as you gain weight, but in most people. So here you have sort of a healthy fat cell. There's not much inflammatory chemicals that are being made. There's not much of a negative effect on the blood vessels that are going through it. And then as you go to the right here, these are fat cells that have a bunch of pro-inflammatory mediators that are being created. There's a whole bunch of signals that are being that are starting in those fat cells, these sick fat cells, if you will, that then go out to the rest of the body and carry these inflammation signals to the rest of the body. And so it's in those fat cells and in those people that show those fat cells that ultimately develop the diseases associated with obesity. So, for example, when inflammatory signals increase in the liver, you end up storing more fat in the liver, you end up creating inflammation in the liver, and that ends up predisposing to diabetes, for example. Same thing with a number of other tissues in the body, but it all comes back to this concept of inflammation that's driving so much of the chronic diseases that occur from obesity. And so one of the things you've probably read about on Huffington Post or in the newspaper is that there are some people that gain a lot of weight, and yet they don't show any of the health problems down the line of that obesity. And that's absolutely true. There's something like 10 or 15% of people who have obesity, and at the same time...
Maybe we have all the slides, I don't know.
Thank you. I think what happened is when I emailed my slides, probably a few just got lost, and that's the one that's up here, but that's okay. So there's about 10 or 15% of people that have obesity and yet don't develop, even decades down the line, don't develop the health problems that are typically associated with obesity. And one of the key reasons for that is that they don't have the same inflammatory drive caused by that obesity that other people have. So on the one hand, addressing weight is certainly one of the ways that we want to go about this. But on the other hand, simply addressing the mediator of obesity can have as powerful effects as addressing the obesity itself. So let's look at just a few things that we can think about in a bottom line way on what we can do. So first of all, moderate weight loss and physical activity lowers inflammation, mediates this inflammatory process. Now, when I say moderate weight loss, I mean a weight loss that often is imperceptible. 5% of body weight loss, 7% of body weight loss. So we're talking 15 pounds, give or take. And yet that amount of weight loss, if it's done in a way that's sustainable, can make immeasurable differences on your long-term health. It cuts your risk of getting diabetes by about 60% in people who are at risk. It cuts the likelihood of a number of cancers by a significant amount. It cuts the likelihood of heart disease by a significant amount. So again, we're not talking about huge diets. We're not talking about losing 100 pounds. We're talking about very moderate decreases in weight that can make enough of a change in inflammation and other mediators of obesity's harms to significantly improve health. The process of inflammation is ubiquitous in the body. So when if you were to fall and scrape your arm, for example, the process of healing, where there's a whole bunch of blood cells that come in and clean up the necrotic and the dead tissue and shoot it out, and then other blood cells come in and bring in nutrients and such to heal from that. That is a process of inflammation, and that's a very healthy process of inflammation. On the flip side, there's many other types and degrees of inflammation that occur in the body that aren't so healthy. So, for example, traditionally, we thought of having a heart attack as a very simple process of you gain more and more cholesterol over your lifetime, and that clogs up the artery in your heart that the blood flows through, and eventually you clog it up enough that no blood can go through it, and you get a heart attack. And that's not at all what happens. What actually happens is that you do increase your cholesterol throughout life, and that does, to a small degree, clog that artery, but almost never enough that it clogs it off completely. What happens is when there's inflammation that goes on inside the wall of the artery where the cholesterol is, and it's very active in there, there's a lot of inflammation going on in there, and then eventually it breaks open a little bit, and just like with a cut, you get a clot. Essentially in that area where it breaks open, you get a clot there, and it's that immediate clotting secondary to the activity and the inflammation that's going on in the blood vessel that impedes the blood flow and leads to potentially a heart attack. So examples of good inflammation and bad inflammation, if you will, but the process itself is a ubiquitous process in the body. So the other piece of this is physical activity. If you've ever tried to exercise as part of a weight loss plan, my guess is some of you may have lost some weight sometimes, but most of the time, exercise doesn't lead to that much weight loss. It's just so easily overwhelmed by the amount of food that we tend to eat on a given day. For example, if you were to go to the gym and work out really hard for an hour, you have a half of a muffin or something like that, and you've already eaten as many calories as you've burned during that gym session. But exercise is one of the healthiest things that you can do for yourself. It relieves stress, it helps your joints, and it lowers inflammation. So again, the concept here is moderate. Moderate weight loss, moderate amounts of physical activity, even if it doesn't lead directly to weight loss, can significantly decrease inflammation and ultimately lead to a more reasonable way of managing both your weight and your long-term health over time. So another example we have here that we know of pretty well is what's called a cafeteria diet. Believe it or not, there's not very good data that a high-fat diet is either particularly good for you or particularly bad for you. And there's not very good data that shows that a low-fat diet is particularly good for you or particularly bad for you. I think preference is more important on whether you go toward one end or the other end on that. What we do know is that what we call a cafeteria diet is across the board known to be pretty darn unhealthy. And a cafeteria diet is pretty much the foods that you tend to have available to you at most cafeterias. So things like chips and cookies and muffins and so forth. So this is a cool study that was done. Again, this was done in mice, but we see similar things in humans. And they were randomized to one of 4 groups. They either got the standard chow diet, it's SC in this picture, or they got a low-fat diet, or they got a high-fat diet, or they got a cafeteria diet. And so the mice that got the standard chow, they didn't gain any weight. They had low levels of inflammation. They were good to go. The mice that ate either the high-fat or the low-fat diet, they gained a little bit of weight. They didn't have significantly increased inflammation. They went about their merry ways. The mice that got the cafeteria diet quickly and significantly gained quite a lot of weight. Inflammation levels went up, and a number of other poor outcomes ended up having. So a cafeteria diet is high in, first of all, pretty unhealthy fats like saturated fats and trans fats and so forth. It's also very high in very simple sugars and starches like the starches that are in chips and so forth. It's also very high in salt, for example. Whereas a high-fat diet that's high in fat from, say, fish, high in fat even from moderate fat poultry or even red meat tends to be of a different type of fat, and which I'm actually going to talk about, and does not lead to these outcomes like with the cafeteria diet. Vegetable oils generally don't lead to the increased inflammation and weight gain from a cafeteria diet type of eating. So I would say forget about this special diet, that special diet, or the like. Very small guiding principles in a diet can be extremely valuable when it comes to the health benefits of that diet. And I think one of the key ones is if you can minimize the type of cafeteria foods you eat, you're going to be better off than with any other detailed diet. So this is a study that is just about to be published. There was about 40 people in it. It was done in a lab, and everything was very, very carefully controlled. And these people were randomized to one of two groups. Both groups were overfed, so they were purposely given 750 calories more than they needed every day. The goal in this study was to see how much weight they gained and how they gained it. Okay, so both groups got 750 calories of a high-fat muffin as how they overate, right? In one group, that high-fat muffin was made from oils that are very high in saturated fat. And in the other group, that high-fat muffin was made from oils that are high in polyunsaturated fats. And it was a really striking difference in what happened. So in the group that overfed, both groups gained weight. It was just over the course of a few weeks. They both gained around 3.5 pounds or so. In the group that ate the high saturated fat muffins, they gained almost all of that fat, almost all of that weight as fat. In the group that ate the polyunsaturated fat muffins, they gained very little fat. On the flip side, when we look at lean tissue or muscle, the group that was eating the polyunsaturated fat muffin, they gained quite a bit of muscle. So their weight gain was a healthy weight gain, whereas the group that ate the saturated fat muffin gained very little muscle. So this was just over the course of a few weeks. A really striking difference occurred just from the type of nutrient they were eating, the type of food they were eating. We know that saturated fats, specifically certain types of saturated fats, can cause that hypothalamic inflammation that I pointed out before. And we know that polyunsaturated fats often are anti-inflammatory. So that's another take-home that I think is very valuable. Moderating saturated fats, trying to increase your intake of polyunsaturated fats as part of a healthy diet can make a really tangible difference in inflammation levels, in weight levels. And so this is an example of what might be called an anti-inflammatory pyramid. So similar to the pyramids that the USDA makes, this specifically is looking at foods and proportional amounts of foods to eat in order to minimize inflammation. So, and on the next page, and you guys have it in your slides, I listed out some very specific examples. But here at the bottom, the foods that we want to eat the most of are sort of real foods. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, beans, legumes, whole grains, the healthy fats like the polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats, so things like avocados and nuts have those kind of healthy fats in them, fish and seafood, perhaps soy foods, mushrooms are a very healthy food, and so forth. And then at the top, in the area where you want to minimize those foods, certainly cafeteria diet type foods would be up there. Here you have dark chocolate, which is a very healthy snack in moderation. So that's one that you can eat there. Red wine in moderation can be anti-inflammatory, and actually any alcohol in moderation can be valuable around inflammation. Perhaps some supplements, tea, coffee are chock full of antioxidants and healthy nutrients. So thinking about it this way, for me at least, when I see these foods, I mean, these are a lot of the foods that I genuinely enjoy eating. And so this type of a cuisine is very much appealing to me. Here's a list, an easy way to think about some foods that are more pro-inflammatory versus others that are anti-inflammatory. So on the one hand, fast food, processed foods tend to be pro-inflammatory. What I call real foods tend to be anti-inflammatory. Again, fruits, vegetables, foods that God put on the earth, if you will. Trans fats and saturated fats, those are those high-fat nutrients that can increase inflammation, as opposed to unsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. Sugars and starches are pro-inflammatory in excess. Fiber and low glycemic index foods tend to decrease inflammation. Glycemic index is a measure of how quickly a carbohydrate food is digested in the body. So essentially, if a food that is high glycemic index, like sugars and starches, it's absorbed very quickly into your body. It raises your blood sugar very quickly. That changes a whole bunch of hormones in your body, and that leads to downstream effects that are not so healthy. On the flip side, a low glycemic index food tends to be very slowly digested. It tends to be very slowly absorbed into your bloodstream. It doesn't peak your sugar level up or your insulin level up, and it tends to be much smoother in terms of your energy levels and in terms of a number of inflammatory markers. And you can easily just put glycemic index into Google, and it'll give you a whole list and teach you a whole bunch about that. So here's some more of these anti-inflammatory type foods. Inactivity or excessive activity, both can increase inflammation, whereas a moderate amount of physical activity can moderate inflammation. Weight gain, not in everybody, but in many people, tends to increase inflammation, and moderate weight loss tends to decrease inflammation. And so I left it there as some big picture things that hopefully you can take home and find useful.
Spectacular.
Thank you.